There we go. It's always good to be with you all. Let's see, we'll share the screen. Get started on old Mark again. So last time we saw the end of Jesus's sort of public ministry, or at least his ministry before that last Holy Week. Now, and we witnessed that conversion of Bartimaeus, a true disciple. We can say either way we interpreted that, whether it was a critique of the Timaeus philosophy, or if it was just a random guy named Bartimaeus that we don't know anything else about. Either way, he's definitely a true disciple. And then we turn now today to Palm Sunday, to everything happening in Jerusalem. So without further ado, we'll just start chapter 11. When they were approaching Jerusalem on Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, he, Jesus, sent two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it, and will send it back here immediately.'" Euthus. They went away and found a colt tied near a door outside in the street. And as they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, "What are you doing untying the colt?" They told them what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven." Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. All right, so we have the triumphal entry, the Palm Sunday entry, whatever we want to talk about it. So just a quick note, I'm now going to add the book The Last Week by Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan to my references. They do a lot with the book is literally called, obviously, The Last Week. It's almost exclusively focusing on Mark's telling of the story. So they have a lot more detail than, say, some of the others that have a commentary on the whole book, can't necessarily focus on that last section as much. Those men note that there are two big entries into Jerusalem that we know about: the triumphal entry, the Palm Sunday entry, thanks to Scripture. We don't tend to know about the other. And that is, the first was likely Pilate and the Roman legions coming to demonstrate the raw power of empire during a liberation festival, right? So it's Passover. Passover is literally about celebrating Israel's escape from Egypt and God's helping them to be liberated from that difficult situation. The Romans aren't dummies. They know how this works. So they send in extra troops to make sure that everyone sees the power of Rome and don't get any bright ideas about starting a big revolution at the same time. There's almost a full chapter on this, but they make a big point of saying that Pilate rides a white war charger. Men are dressed in full battle armor. It's a classic military parade that comes in from the west, I believe. And so they see this as Borg and Crossan, and knowing that other parade happened every year and was noted in ancient texts, see this as a pre-planned political demonstration. That is, Jesus and his disciples know that there's going to be a big parade on one side of town, so they set up a pre-planned political demonstration on the other side of town. That is, Pilate enters from the west, Jesus from the east. They literally enter from two different sides of the city. And instead of a war charger, Jesus shows up on a tiny donkey, perhaps even a foal. And the poor are parading with him, right? They're throwing their cloaks on the ground. And instead of this image of power, you really have an image pretty much of poverty almost, of a bunch of poor people cheering and excited, but not anything like the power of Rome on the other side. And then there's a direct reference to Zechariah. Lo, your king comes to you triumphant and victorious. Is he, I think it said, for triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey of colt, the foal of a donkey. Right? So it is not an explicit quote that Mark says. Matthew makes it explicit, but Mark has it just sort of in the background. Most folks would remember it. Most folks would know that this was one of those references that Jesus is intentionally enacting. And again, if it's a pre-planned political demonstration, they probably all knew this text and were going to intentionally enact it as a way to oppose what was going on the other side of town, right? So interestingly, few scholars note, the placard does note that the king in that moment, that the king that Zechariah talks about is God himself. It's not a king, right? You look at this and you hear, lo, your king comes to you, and you think, oh, it's another messianic prediction. But placard notes that no, the king is God himself, because Zechariah had gotten tired of waiting for a Messiah of any type. And when they showed up, they always tended to mess things up more than to help. So Zechariah was prophesying and hoping for a day when God would come, instead of these guys that keep coming and claiming to be the great new king, but oops, it doesn't work, or I'm going to be the Messiah who will fix stuff. So Zechariah, when he makes these predictions, literally says it's God himself who will come to save Israel. That's who's going to have to finally fix this mess, and it can't be anybody else. So Borg and Crossan then know that the next verse is the key to understanding what's going on. That is, Zechariah continues. We have this part that we know, but the next verse reads, he will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. Right? So if, and it seems like they would be right, if Borg and Crossan are right, and Jesus and company know this Zechariah verse, then they're intentionally creating a peaceful protest on one side of town, while Pilate is basically sharing the power, authority, and quite frankly, violence of Rome on the other side of town. Right? It makes a powerful point to counterpoint that I do think, while it's not as explicit, and Matthew is explicit, but here it is subtext, which means the entire chapter can be subtext in a way that if you only quote one verse, it can't be on the other. That said, again, this is all against imperial power. God comes with an offer of peace instead of war, right? That's Borg and Crossan's assumption. Or instead of the Pax Romani, that is the peace of Rome that comes at the end of a spear, you get the Pax Dei, the peace of God, which is love and welcome instead. And then the fascinating part, Jesus has this big triumphal entry. He looks around and goes home. It was very clearly, this was the only thing he had planned to do that day. All he wanted to do was to intentionally come at a different time and show a different way of being. And then that was the conclusion. It is different, though, from Matthew and Luke, who have Jesus coming in and he's overturning the temple, right? He's clearing the temple. That doesn't happen in day one for Mark. It is one political protest at a time. Thank you very much. Any hint of violence, therefore, is far removed, which probably then supports a little bit more even Borg and Crossan's assertion that this is a peaceful political protest, right? Jesus is purely about the parade and the welcome. More will happen on another day. So that's Borg, Crossan, and Placard's all sort of view of this. Thoughts? We've seen this all a million times thanks to Holy Week. What do you think?
I've never heard about the juxtaposition to the Roman political or military display.
Right.
Which gives it a deeper meaning, I think.
Amen.
The footnotes in the study Bible point out that this was with spreading their cloaks on the road was similar to when Elisha anointed Jehu to lead the rebellion against the oppressive dynasty founded by Omri, which I guess the northern kingdom.
Yeah. All right, well, we'll keep going. No worries. It's a different way of viewing it, but I do think I will say for Borg and Crossan and Placker, all three, that I think these are accurate ways of understanding it. I don't think it's doing any violence to the text to read this or to hear these stories in the larger context. So we continue. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry, and seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Now, this is one of those fascinating things. We could stop here and just talk about the fig tree by itself, but this is an inclusio, one of those narrative sandwiches that Mark creates. So I chose to just go ahead and give both sides of that story instead of breaking it up and trying to look at it piecemeal, just so you know. So then, then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything to the temple. He was teaching and saying, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." Jesus answered them, "I have faith in God. Truly, amen, I tell you, if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses." All right. So Jesus, if we start off with Jesus gets mad at a fig tree, and if we take that just as, sort of verse jerk and just read it, it is a really bizarre passage because it doesn't seem remotely fair, right? I mean, it's not the season for figs. It's not going to have figs. Why did he get mad at it for not having figs on a day when it would not be expected to have figs anyway? It's a really quirky tale by itself, right? It's pretty irrational. It's pretty crazy. But if we've listened to all these other 10 chapters of Mark where he tells those inclusio narrative sandwiches, then we know more is happening. Just a reminder that he will put a story beginning and end around another story, and they're supposed to interpret each other, right? The fig tree is talking about the cleansing of the temple, and the cleansing of the temple should be telling us about the fig tree. So, that's what I just said. Intentionally tells a story of the fig tree wrapped around the story of the temple. So we focus on the money changers because Jesus overturns them, but we may not have quite the right references, right? So we all have heard the story of the money changers. And I've heard more than a few sermons talk about how the money changers were defrauding the people, or it was a whole temple scheme, right, to get rich, and they would trick people when they changed the money, and then they would sell them faulty animals, or they sell them good animals, but at exorbitant prices, all those kinds of things. And it was part of the temple system. That's how it often gets described, right? The temple system is what Jesus is correcting. And that's the traditional reading, right? Jesus is horrified at the money changers who were likely swindling the poor. He demands reform and change. That's the whole point of this story, which I think we probably all heard. preached, taught, explained, and engaged, right? So that's the traditional way that people have talked about it. As Borg and Crossan, as well as Placker, proclaimed, Jesus is rejecting the corruption of the temple. It's time for something new. It's time for a new way of worshiping God. And again, they're all sort of in the same boat. They have slightly different ways of getting to it, but it's all very much related. A.J. Levine, though, asked the question, then if it is against the temple, then why does Jesus applaud the widow who gives her last coin to the temple in another chapter, two chapters from now, right? Like literally middle of the next chapter, maybe 2 days later, he tells the disciples, look at this widow who gave all of her money to the temple. Isn't that great? And she has given so wonderfully. Seems weird to condemn the entire temple system and then 2 days later approve of it, or at least approve of people giving money to it. If it was truly a corrupt system, wouldn't he say like, oh, that widow shouldn't have put anything in the pot, that they're just going to rob her blind, right? It's a weird kind of thing. So I think it's an appropriate question to ask. What else is going on? So one of the big things that we tend to misinterpret, that I've heard misinterpreted many, many times, is you have made it a den of thieves, right? It's supposed to be a house of prayer. You have made it a den of thieves, which is a quote. But the big key is thieves don't steal in their den. They hoard treasure there, right? Like we have to take this apart and talk about what happens. What does it mean to be a den of thieves? A den is the place, a safe place where they can keep and hide their bounty. Okay, so said differently, a lion kills in the wild, but they rest in their den and maybe bring food back to the den. If we pay attention to that, then that's likely what Jesus is engaging a little bit more, and he's condemning others, right? So what he's saying is, first of all, he's quoting Jeremiah 7:11, and the chapter is very concerned that Israel is treating people poorly, but specifically the poor, the hungry, the homeless, the lost, that Israel is behaving horribly towards those that God favors. And then they want the temple to be a place where things are okay. And the famous quote right before this is, do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord. Like that will make it okay. In other words, Jesus is pretty much saying, you can't go out and rob people and then come here and think everything's okay. The people are the problem, not the temple. Okay. That is, I've had A.J. Levine and I had this conversation. This is 100% what she thinks, and I'm in full agreement with her. Jesus is not critiquing the temple system. He's critiquing the heart of the people, which, if you've been listening to Mark the whole time, is very consonant with Mark, right? He's always concerned with where people are and what they're doing, their intention, more than a whole lot of the other stuff. And basically, Jesus is saying, you can't go outside the temple and kill people and steal and lie and pillage and covet and defraud the poor and treat the widow and the outcast any way you want, and then buy 2 turtle doves and make it all better. Right? That's not how it's supposed to work. You're supposed to be doing the best you can out there. And then when you do mess up, you can come here and make up for it. But you can't intentionally be a jerk all the time and just think, well, if I buy a lamb, it'll be okay. Right? That's the whole thrust, I think, of Jesus's real complaint is, no, the people are the problem. You have made it a den of thieves. You're a bunch of thieves who come in here, treat people horribly out in the world, and then come in here and think it's okay to ignore how you've treated the poor. That's a different reading. So we'll stop for a second. Questions, thoughts? Is it a new reading? Have you heard this before, or is it one you've engaged yourself?
So I have read in Joel Levine's book, The Passion. Now, but I read it last year during Lent, and I did hear that explanation. It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Are you going to get to the part where the significance of surrounding it with the stories about the fig tree, or am I missing something?
Oh yeah, no, we'll come back to that. First was just
Okay.
we first is to unpack one of the stories, so then we can engage the other story, right?
Okay,
I've forgotten. No
okay.
worries.
No, I was making sure I hadn't missed something glaring.
You have it. But for
It
either,
sort of raises the question about what is salvation, how one obtains salvation, the whole faith versus works issue, sort of.
true, yeah. Yeah, it definitely is that faith versus works argument, and it's also, I guess, I also hear though Jesus saying like you can't that works do matter on some degree, right? Like it's not purely you get to do whatever you want you're in either, right? There's some degree of that. Not works righteousness. I don't even hear it as that. It's just you got to try.
Right.
You just got to go out there and at least try. Don't do whatever you think you can want to do and then act like it covers up.
Well, it poses the question of exactly where that comes to play, because there's the thief on the cross next to Jesus, and he's obviously not lived a good day or a good life, the whole time. And he asked Jesus for forgiveness at that point, and he said, "You will be with me in paradise." So, putting that in context with this, it puts a pretty interesting question: is where is the dividing line?
Oh, that's Luke.
That is Luke.
That's Luke. That's
True.
Luke's story.
Well, and he didn't have a chance to change and live a different life. I mean, he was on the cross and dying, so, I don't know.
Bill, isn't this all about, isn't what Jesus is saying, it's what's in the heart?
Yes, I think that's fair. I think that's a fair
It's what's
assessment.
in the heart. Okay, it's not what you're doing, it's what's in the heart. Okay, and I mean, and that ties in with the woman who comes up later, okay, the one in the temple who gives her the last coin. It's what's in the heart. Okay, it's not necessarily the action, it's what's in the heart.
Amen.
Okay.
Yeah, we've seen Mark focus a lot on this motivation point.
Yeah.
What's your motive in doing it? It's not just what you do.
Exactly. Okay. It's and it also ties with this is a house of prayer, okay, whatever it is. And you need to be able to forgive before you can ask to be forgiven. I mean, it all ties in, okay?
Right.
I think.
No, I think
Now,
it's
it's interesting. I'm interested to hear though how the fig tree ties in. So we'll have to get to that in a minute.
yeah, we'll have to get to that.
I haven't figured that one out, Bill.
Yeah.
But okay.
I don't know if I have an answer either, but I can at least tell what people say they think it is.
Okay.
Anything else for this part, for at least for the challenge we got in front of us for cleansing the temple? And even the name, right, seems to be an interpretation. This is where naming stories and events matter. When you call it cleansing the temple, well, it sure sounds like he's trying to change the temple, not the people.
Yeah,
That doesn't
that
mean that
is-
naming it is accurate either, right?
no, but it's helpful to point that out. And the thing about the lion is even helpful.
No, it's very helpful. And I'll be honest, until I was talking to AJ about it, I never thought of it, but I was like, well, duh, of course, of course
Yeah.
that's the case. But you don't think about it until someone draws your attention to it. And then looking back at Zechariah, when you read that passage of Zechariah, the whole thing is just, you go and do whatever you want. You treat the poor horribly, and then you come in and say, oh, we have the temple, everything's okay. And it's like, no, I will not spare you because of the temple. That's not enough. Worshiping the right God doesn't mean you get to treat everyone else terribly. All right, so we'll keep going. So Jesus is concerned about people and about their hearts, right? As we've sort of even further delineated. And then the question really is, what fruit do you bear? What fruit does Israel bear? The people that are gathered, right? So the people that are in the temple are going to largely be Jews, are going to be his fellow Jews. And what fruit does that community bear? And so when we have bad fruit or no fruit, Jesus will rebuke or curse that tree that has not borne fruit. Again, folks connected to the temple, and we'll talk about the traditional reading of this story then would say, oh, because Jesus, and this is what Placker explicitly says, and they say to a lesser degree with Borg and Crossan, is they'll say, oh, well, because he's trying to overthrow the temple system, then this is proof that the temple will be destroyed, right? That the fig tree is prototypical of, it's sort of a prediction of the temple's fall and the destruction of the temple that will happen in the revolution, right, in AD 70. And that's how it's interpreted when we go that way. When we say that Jesus's cleansing of the temple was to really critique the financial system and the sacrifice system of the temple, then that's how it gets interpreted that way, right? So how we interpret each depends. So what we can say is, and this is where sometimes people also read this stuff in, the temple is destroyed by Rome in the coming revolution and war in AD 70, right? So it's about 40 years, 35 years, depending on when we quote, when Jesus's life is going on and when he's finishing everything, somewhere in that range, 30, 35 years later. And most believe that's about the time because, again, we've talked about this, right? Mark is writing quickly. He seems to be referencing lots of destruction and talking about how the temple might be destroyed. And even this particular verse is sometimes used as indicative that he was writing at the time of the temple being destroyed. And that's part of how the fig tree makes sense, is if he was writing at the time of this moment, this terrible devastation, then he might be referencing it there within the fig tree. Now, again, we focus on the temple. The temple was destroyed, and I'm sure all of you have heard that. We've all heard this a million times. I've heard it a million times. We focus on the war and, the temple was destroyed, right? But it's not the temple's fault that it was destroyed. It's the people. Again, Israel decided to rise up and revolt. And Jesus's larger concern is the heart of the people and the people themselves, right? And that's the part that we then forget with that revolution in AD 70. The people are at fault for not caring for the poor, the hungry, the sick, the widow, and the orphan. And they would say that the war and the destruction of the temple is because of their refusal to live into God's larger covenant, that God then decides not to protect the temple, right? If we sort of believe in that binary system, could just be that they decided to rise up and try and throw off a more powerful country, right? But that's how, at least it can be in part interpreted and how they would talk about it. I don't know that that's accurate, but you understand the argument there. So the temple is destroyed in AD 70, but so is all of Jerusalem, right? This is the part that we often skip. I don't know if y'all have ever heard this before, but according to Josephus, 1 million Jews were killed. 97,000 were taken as slave and the city completely destroyed. It was Passover, and so they said all the Jews were gathered for the Passover, and that's why so many were killed, because they had all flocked to Jerusalem, and therefore it was more were gathered. Most modern scholars say that's not vaguely possible. There was 1 million people in all of Palestine at that era. And they didn't kill everyone in Palestine. And even if there were 1 million Jews around the whole world, they probably weren't all in Jerusalem that day and all killed, right? Most of them have it probably a tenth, give or take, of those numbers, that there were perhaps 100,000 Jews were killed and maybe 9,700 were taken as slaves, something along those lines. That's still a lot of people. Doesn't matter either way, right? So the temple absolutely matters, but the devastation is not exclusive to the temple, right? In fact, this whole situation is both the people and the temple are destroyed at the same time, right? It is a devastating event on multiple levels, not just, oh, the temple was overthrown and then the people continued to worship God in a new way. That's not exactly the story, right? I mean, the story is a lot of the people chose to revolt because they wanted to, again, in the Passover tradition, throw off it be a liberation festival. It doesn't work. They get killed. There's a larger conversation to be had there, right? All that said, we want all of this to be about religious reform, but it seems to me likely, at least, that it's much more about the heart of God's people then and now. Are we concerned about the poor and the hungry and the lost? Or are we concerned about who's in power, right? Are we concerned about the right worship of God, what's in our hearts and how we care for those folks and do the right thing? Or are we more concerned about, making sure the system works? I honestly think Jesus is okay with worship wherever it may be of God, but it's how do we focus on how we order our whole lives that Jesus is after, right? He's always, in the Gospel of Mark, he is always after that. How have you ordered your whole life? How does your finances, like the rich ruler, if your finances don't match up to all of the other stuff you're doing, then you're not there yet, right? If you're going about your regular day and just offer a couple of turtle doves to get back in God's favor, knowing that you're not going to change and get any better, not really what Jesus is about either. Cool. All right. So if you have faith, it will be, well, we'll stop there. We'll stop there first, because then we'll conclude with that whole, if you have faith, it will be answered. That's another whole conundrum that we got to unpack. Thoughts about that? Does that answer the fig tree?
Well, the footnotes point out that when Herod the Great rebuilt the temple,
Mhm.
to make it one of the wonders of the ancient world, it was the whole temple complex was much more than just a site for worship. But you really did have it was like a shopping arcade or whatever. I mean, so it was the seat of government and commerce, all wrapped around the worship space.
Yeah, I read somewhere, I want to say it's the outer courts, like the temple remained the temple, but the outer courts that he created were something like 6 football fields or something insane like that. I mean, it was a giant space that was very vast, open, and used for a whole variety of things, teaching and commerce, all kinds of things.
And didn't Jesus's actions occur in the outer area, not where Gentiles were mostly?
Yeah, I don't know that we have a clear idea of exactly where he was teaching this part, because there was the court of the Gentiles and there's the sort of inner court of the Jews, which then also were men. Women weren't allowed into some of the inner courts as well in that era. It's not clear, unfortunately. It doesn't say like he was teaching in the court of the Gentiles, or he was teaching this. Every now and then it'll say in Solomon's portico, and so we know where that area was, and sort of, but it's not, this part is not explicit about that. I think they've got some ideas about where the stalls might have been set up, so they could guess that it was probably in the more the shopping district, for lack of a better term, but it's hard to say, right? If that's where it was, or if there was an area that was more about the religious preparation for the temple.
Craig shared an interesting article with the EFM group because of a conversation we had Tuesday about an image that Bishop Wright had used. Alex mentioned during our class about the cross and the vertical beam being thought to kind of represent our relationship with God, and the horizontal beam being thought to be representative of our relationships with each other. And that just, I mean, it ties in directly with the image. Just came to me after rereading the article this morning that Craig sent. So it's interesting how it's all tying together, even with these stories.
Yeah, I think it makes sense.
I find it very interesting because I have read a lot of the books on the near-death experiences. And there's a common thread through all of those experiences where when you get to the being of light, now Christians call it Jesus, Arabs call it Mohammed, whoever, but this incredible light, loving light, the first thing that you are asked about yourself is, what have you done to help your fellow man? And I think about the second commandment. I think about a lot of what we're talking here, and it all really ties up pretty nice. Because it's all about, as you just said, what have we done? How have we lived our lives? And, is it sincere in our heart as to how we care about other people and do things to help our fellow man? And I think a lot of this kind of ties together for me there.
Yeah.
I can send the link to that article that Karen mentioned to y'all. It's a good read. It's a little long and it's extraordinarily Catholic. So you might have to overlook a few things, like we are as humans are patently inferior, and adoration of the Eucharist in the chapel, and
Yeah.
very Catholic things. But I really like the way this blog expands the that theology of the bars and the horizontal and the vertical. It was enlightening to me.
Yeah, sounds like it.
The concept too, that if one gets out of balance, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right.
They have to work in tandem with each other.
All right. Well, we'll keep going. There's a lot in these passages. Like I said, the next part is, if you have faith, it will be answered, right? And I have no answer for that part, where Jesus is saying, if you just have enough faith, this mountain will be moved. Now, Placker expressly points out that if they are standing talking about everything like they have been elsewhere, they are standing by the temple mountain, the mount of the temple, and it's another reference to the fact that the temple will be destroyed. I don't hear that here. I guess that could be the case, that the temple mount will be destroyed, but I don't know that that's what Jesus meant. There is a teaching that a rabbi can move mountains with his teachings, which may be more of what that was contemporary at that time. Maybe more akin to that idea that if you teach people and give them faith, that things can change quickly. Maybe it's along those lines. But again, this one, the way it's been interpreted is that, like, if you just pray hard enough, it'll all be fixed, right? If you just have enough faith and believe, then it's all going to be there. But I can say, at least for me, and I'm probably sure for all of you, we've prayed fervently for one thing or another, and it doesn't get answered. And I don't think it's always a lack of conviction or faith that leads to some of my prayers not being answered, quite frankly. Maybe for some, but there are plenty of times when I look back and go, oh, if I'd been given the thing, if I had that perfect faith that God had done exactly what I asked God to do, I would be in a worse spot than I turned out was when God said no, right? Or there's some times when there's better wisdom involved than just what I want that day. And again, this gets into that complexity of prayer and all that kind of stuff, but Jesus brings it up and states it in such a way that it's really hard for us just to sort of walk around or end with, right? And I really, Placker pretty much sort of makes that comment. My favorite is Borg and Crossan are pretty much like, and that just continues the story. They just skip it completely in their book. because it is, I mean, this is a tricky turn of phrase that Jesus gives us, right? Like if you just have enough faith, you can move mountains. It'll jump up and run in the sea and all that. And you go, okay, thanks. Maybe for you, Jesus, but I don't know about for me. I don't know. Thoughts? What do y'all think about this section of this story?
I've always had so much trouble with this because, you know, particularly like we have St. Jude Children's Hospital here in Memphis. And right now there are like 3 children that I'm praying for. And one was a former student who is now in college, and he is doing well. And it looks like he's going to be okay. And so many people have been praying for him, and a couple of others that looks like one's going to be okay. And one is a young child and not doing well. And, you know I'm praying. I know so many people are praying fervently for these children to be healed and be okay.
Mhm.
And then sometimes it's that thing of people feeling like if you just have enough faith, then they'll be healed. I don't know. I get very, very upset about that because that's just not the way it works. You know, I feel like there are a lot of people, their parents, their families, and you know, it's all over Facebook, it's all over their churches, you know, with all the people praying and having faith in St. Jude, and many, many children are saved there, but not everyone.
Mm-mm.
So,
Well, you know, it really makes you think, because for a while we were active with the Compassionate Friends. That's groups of parents who've lost a child. And about a third of the parents in that group had lost their children through cancer at St. Jude. And you know, tremendous prayers are being offered for those children. And some of them were just, you know, itsy bitsy ones, and yet they lost. And it really makes you wonder, you know, how are those prayers answered, or are they ignored, or what happens to that? That's what I was saying earlier. It really kind of made me feel better in what we were saying a little earlier about it's how you have it in your heart about life. And yet these children, you know, they're young, they're little, you know, some of them just little babies, and here they have these horrible problems with cancer, and
have their whole life ahead, should have their whole life ahead of them.
they don't have a chance.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I
We
guess
don't know.
I guess that has always bothered me, because I have heard people feel like, well, the prayer wasn't answered because people didn't have enough faith. And
Yeah, I have a tough time with that too.
you know,
What is
Yeah.
enough faith? What does that mean? What is
I
enough?
know. I mean,
What's not enough? What's enough? I mean, come on. I mean, do we measure it in milliliters or
Where's the
what?
dial?
I mean, I
Come
know.
on now.
You can't. I know you can't.
Well, Eugene Peterson's take on this in the Message, and in the same paragraph, he continues the paragraph with the next verse, but his paraphrase reads, "That's why I encourage you to pray for absolutely everything, ranging from small to large. Include everything as you embrace this God life, and you'll get God's everything. And when you assume the posture of prayer, remember that it's not all asking. If you have anything against someone, forgive. Only then will your heavenly Father be inclined to also wipe your slate clean of sins."
Mhm. Yeah.
So there's this piece about how you orient yourself, you know, what's your orientation and what you're asking for, and it's sort of the "thy will be done" approach.
Mhm.
Not always easy to discern.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
And also thanking God for your blessings too. And
Well, I have taught a class several times on the Lord's Prayer. And everyone's always okay with it until we get to the same exact place, and that is this idea that Jesus says here too, right? Like, how much you're forgiven is dependent on how much you forgive others. And everyone always wants to change the subject because no one wants to get into that. Because that's a hard threshold to go like, wait, I have to forgive all of them to get my forgive. Oh, but that's
Yeah.
exactly what we say in the Lord's Prayer every time, right? Like, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin, not if we or when we or something like it's as we, it's literally, it's this at the same level that we forgive others, let us be forgiven. So you're like, uh-oh, I haven't been very forgiving. If there's not much mercy in me, then how much mercy will I be shown?
But you have to show the intent of wanting true forgiveness. You can't say, well, just forgive old Joe over there. He did something really bad. You've got to actually believe and have in your heart the intent. That's what this whole section's about, I think.
Then we gotta forgive those people.
Yeah, even though they are stinkers.
Yeah, even though they're stinkers. Oh, me. Yeah, that's sometimes tough.
Yeah, it's tough. It's the only reconciliation I can bring to it is just to believe that God does not have everybody on a little individual string.
No, absolutely.
And he doesn't, or God does not, God does not say, okay, I think I'm going to let this kid die of cancer right now, boom. Or, okay, I'm going to let this 4-year-old be shot by a stray bullet that was intended for somebody else. Or, I don't know. I just, it's easier to say that than it is to say that God answered this prayer. It's just not the answer I wanted.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had some crappy things happen in my life, and I've been able to see the blessing from them later on when I couldn't see it at the time, but I've never lost a child. I mean, my stories pale in comparison to losing a child. So.
Thanks.
We'll look, there's just about 6 more verses in the rest of this chapter. So we'll look at those real quick and finish up. Again, they came to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, and the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders came to him and said, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority to do them? Jesus said to them, I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Answer me. And they argued with one another. If we say from heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe him? But shall we say of human origin? They were afraid of the crowd, for all regarded John as truly a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we do not know. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things. So this is the conclusion of chapter 11. There's not a whole lot to say about it other than I think Jesus gives the perfect comeback. Basically, he's trying to, they're challenging his authority. But if you think about it, I'm sure his answer would be, I get my authority from God, from heaven. I mean, he would say exactly what he asks them. But by turning the question back on them, he shows that they're not willing to admit any of it, right? Jesus knows John's authority came from heaven. Most of those gathered would agree. But they can't say it, right? Those asking, trying to trick Jesus. And it also means that they would not accept Jesus' authority, even if he proclaimed it. I mean, I think if Jesus had actually just given them a simple answer, they would have ignored that as well. He was more showing their hypocrisy in the moment. Like, well, I can tell you where it came from, but you weren't going to believe it anyway. So what does it matter, bud? So he left them to ponder what they likely suspected he might say anyway. Thoughts on that sort of closing verses? Jesus having fun with his interlude.
Great answer. I mean, that was an absolutely great answer. Okay.
Well, we've seen all these folks who recognized who Jesus is, whether it was the demoniac or but here he's encountering the religious leaders, and they don't have a clue, apparently.
Not even sorta. I hadn't thought of that, but very true.
But I kind of think that's Mark's theme, isn't it? Nobody has a clue. Not the disciples, except for Jesus. Nobody seems to have a clue, right?
No one's catching on, that's for sure. Good stuff. Good stuff, my friends. Well, yeah, so we'll gather next week. We'll look at chapter 12 as we march towards the cross. And just have a good time catching up then.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Bill.
Perfect.
It's great to see everybody.
Great to be with everybody.
Thank you so much. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye, y'all.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.